American Sphinx, The Character of Thomas Jefferson, by Joseph J. Ellis. Introduction. Imagine a man who could write the most powerful words about human freedom the world has ever known, while owning other human beings. Imagine a man who preached a life of simple, rustic virtue, while living in a magnificent mansion filled with the finest wines and art from Europe, sinking deeper into debt every year. Imagine a man who believed in a small, almost invisible government, yet who, as president, would make one of the boldest and most audacious uses of executive power in history, doubling the size of his country with the stroke of a pen. This man is Thomas Jefferson. And if that sounds like a bundle of contradictions, you're beginning to understand why the historian Joseph J. Ellis titled his magnificent book, American Sphinx. A sphinx, as you know, is a mythical creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human, famous for posing a riddle. And for more than 200 years, Jefferson has been the great riddle at the heart of the American story. His face is on our nickel. His words are etched into our national soul. When we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we are speaking his language. He is, in many ways, the architect of the American dream. But who was he, really? That's the question Joseph J. Ellis sets out to answer. This isn't just another biography that lists dates and battles. It's an exploration of character. It's a deep dive into the mind and heart of a man who was, in Ellis's words, a master of self-deception, a man who could hold radically opposing ideas in his head and in his life, and somehow make it work. This book, which won the prestigious National Book Award, isn't just a story about the past. It's a mirror. It shows us that the contradictions that define Jefferson, the soaring ideals and the messy, often disappointing realities, are the very same contradictions that define America itself. By the end of our journey today, you will not just know the facts of Jefferson's life. You will understand the enigmatic heart of a man who was both a profound visionary and a flawed human being. You'll see how his personal struggles shaped his political philosophy, and how his greatest strengths were often inseparable from his deepest weaknesses. You will come face to face with the American Sphinx, and you'll begin to understand the riddle he poses to us, even today. Book summary. To understand the mystery of Thomas Jefferson, we can't start at the beginning of his life. We have to start with a legend. The author, Joseph Ellis, opens his book by talking about what he calls the Jeffersonian surge. It's this incredible, almost magnetic pull that Jefferson has on the American imagination. People from all walks of life, from presidents to poets to furnace repairmen, feel a deep connection to him. They see him as the embodiment of America's highest ideals. But this beloved image, this icon, is also deeply mysterious. As Ellis puts it, working on Jefferson is like entering a crowded room where the conversations never stop, and the stakes are always higher than just historical facts. He's the great Sphinx of American history. So, to get past the myth, Ellis takes us to specific moments in Jefferson's life, not a long, chronological slog, but a series of intense, cinematic snapshots. He zooms in on Jefferson at critical turning points, hoping to catch a glimpse of the real man behind the marble statue. Our first stop is Philadelphia, in 1775. Imagine a tall, slender man in his early 30s, with reddish blonde hair and a quiet, almost shy demeanor. He arrives not with a thunderous speech, but in an elegant carriage called a phaeton, drawn by 4 horses, with 3 enslaved servants in tow. This is Thomas Jefferson, the youngest delegate from Virginia to the Continental Congress. In a room full of powerful orators like John Adams and his fellow Virginian, Patrick Henry, Jefferson is a wallflower. Adams would later say that in all their time in Congress together, he never heard Jefferson utter more than 3 sentences at once. He was a terrible public speaker. Awkward, reserved. But he could write. Oh, how he could write! His reputation preceded him, thanks to a pamphlet he had written called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. It was a blistering attack on British authority, but it was more than just a political argument. It revealed something deep about Jefferson's mind. In it, he didn't just argue legal points. He told a story, a grand, romantic myth about a time long ago, before kings and feudal lords, when the Anglo-Saxons lived in the forests of Germany as free and independent people. This wasn't history as we know it, it was a dream of a perfect, lost world. A world without coercion, a world of natural harmony. This, Ellis tells us, is the key to understanding Jefferson. He was a man who lived in his mind, in a world of ideals. He was a romantic, an idealist who believed that if you could just strip away the corrupt layers of old institutions, of kings, of priests, of inherited power, humanity would naturally return to a state of simple, virtuous harmony. This belief was his superpower. And it was also his greatest blind spot. When the time came for the colonies to declare their independence, the task of drafting the document fell to a committee. John Adams, the bulldog of the Revolution, was the obvious choice. But he deferred to the quiet young man from Virginia. Why? Years later, Adams would say it was because Jefferson was a Virginian, and a Virginian should be at the head of this business. But the truth was simpler. Adams and the others had more important things to do. They were leading the debates on the floor of Congress, managing the war effort. Drafting a declaration was seen as a secondary task, a piece of political theater. They had no idea they were handing Thomas Jefferson the pen that would write him into immortality. He wrote the Declaration of Independence in just a few days, alone in his rented room, on a small, portable lap desk he had designed himself. And in it, he poured his entire philosophical soul. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words are the core of the American creed. They are a recipe for anarchy, as Ellis notes, a wildly idealistic vision of a world where the individual is sovereign, where all external authority is suspect, and where personal freedom leads not to chaos, but to harmony. It was a vision too good to be true. But it was what Jefferson believed. The other delegates in Congress didn't see it as a sacred text. They saw it as a political document that needed editing. They hacked away at it, cutting out a quarter of his original text. Most famously, they removed a long, passionate passage where Jefferson blamed King George III for the slave trade. It was a bizarre and tortured piece of writing, one that condemned slavery as a cruel war against human nature itself, while also blaming the king for inciting enslaved people to rise up against their masters. It was, in a nutshell, Jefferson's entire struggle with slavery laid bare. He knew it was a moral travesty, a poison in the American soul. But he couldn't see a way out. So he did what he would do for the rest of his life. He created a narrative that absolved himself and his fellow planners of responsibility. In his story, slavery was not an American sin, but a British one, forced upon a virtuous people by a corrupt king. It was a complete fiction. But for Jefferson, it was a necessary one. Jefferson sat sullenly as his words were mangled, as he put it. Benjamin Franklin, sitting beside him, tried to console him with a story about a sign painter whose sign was edited down to nothing but a picture of a hat. But Jefferson was inconsolable. His perfect vision had been corrupted by the messy reality of politics. This was a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. He would create a beautiful, harmonious world in his mind, and then be wounded when the real world, with all its compromises and contradictions, failed to measure up. After the Revolution, and after a personal tragedy that would shatter his world, Jefferson's life took a new direction. In 1782, his wife, Martha, died after a difficult childbirth. Jefferson was destroyed. For weeks, he paced his room, sobbing uncontrollably, or rode aimlessly through the woods, a man utterly lost in grief. On her deathbed, Martha had made him promise never to remarry, fearing a stepmother for her children. It was a promise he kept. He would never again allow himself to be so vulnerable. He would build walls around his heart. 2 years later, seeking escape from the ghosts at Monticello, he accepted a diplomatic post in Paris. He arrived in 1784, a widower in his early 40s, with his young daughter Patsy. Paris was a revelation. He fell in love with the architecture, the food, the wine, the sophisticated conversation of the salons. "I am much pleased with the people of this country," he wrote. "The roughness of the human mind are so thoroughly rubbed off with them that it seems as one might glide through a whole life among them without a jostle." But even as he praised the French, he was writing letters back to America condemning the corruption and moral decay of Europe. It was another one of his signature contradictions. He could hold two completely opposite views at the same time, serenely untroubled by the inconsistency. In Paris, he also deepened his friendship with John and Abigail Adams. For 9 months, they were his surrogate family. The stout, passionate, brutally honest John Adams and the tall, reserved, ever elusive Thomas Jefferson, they were the odd couple of the American Revolution. Adams was the realist, the pragmatist who saw the world in all its messy complexity. Jefferson was the idealist, the visionary who saw the world as it ought to be. They were, as Ellis puts it, the words and the music of the American Revolution. Adams provided the hard, complex melody of reality, while Jefferson wrote the soaring, inspirational lyrics of the American dream. Their friendship was a constant dialogue between these two poles. When they confronted the problem of the Barbary pirates who were seizing American ships, Jefferson proposed a grand international coalition to punish them. "It was a matter of honor," he said. Adams rolled his eyes. "A noble idea," he admitted, "but completely impractical. America had no navy and no money. The only realistic option was to pay the ransom." As always, Adams's realism grounded Jefferson's idealism. But Paris wasn't all politics and diplomacy. It was also the scene of the most passionate romance of Jefferson's life. Her name was Maria Cosway. She was the young, beautiful, and unhappily married wife of an English artist. For 6 weeks in the autumn of 1786, Jefferson was utterly besotted. He abandoned his diplomatic duties to spend every day with her, touring the gardens and architectural wonders of Paris. This affair, Ellis suggests, was the ultimate expression of Jefferson's sentimental soul. The whirlwind romance ended when Jefferson, in a moment of youthful exuberance, tried to leap over a fountain and broke his wrist. The injury was severe, and it was botched by French doctors, leaving him in pain for the rest of his life. Before he could recover, Maria Cosway returned to London. Heartbroken, Jefferson wrote her the most self-revealing letter of his entire life. It's a 12-page masterpiece, a dialogue between his head and his heart. His heart speaks of the overwhelming joy of their time together, arguing that the pain of her departure is a small price to pay for such ecstasy. Had they philosophers ever felt the solid pleasure of one generous spasm of the heart, the heart says, they would exchange for it all the frigid speculations of their lives. His head, on the other hand, is the voice of reason, of caution. It scolds the heart for its foolishness, for exposing them both to such pain. In the end, the heart gets the best lines and the last word. But, as Ellis points out, it is the head that is writing the letter. The very act of crafting this elaborate dialogue was Jefferson's way of regaining control over his emotions, of turning a messy, passionate affair into a beautiful, ordered piece of literature. He preferred love, like politics, to be an ideal, a perfect creation of the mind, rather than a complicated reality of the flesh. While in Paris, Jefferson also watched from afar as his colleagues back home wrestled with the future of their new nation. When he heard reports of Chase's rebellion in Massachusetts, a farmer's revolt against taxes, his friends like Abigail Adams were horrified. They saw it as a sign of impending anarchy. Jefferson's reaction was startlingly different. "I like a little rebellion now and then," he wrote. "It is like a storm in the atmosphere." In one of his most famous and chilling lines, he added, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." This wasn't just a passing remark. It revealed the core of his political philosophy. While James Madison was in Philadelphia, painstakingly designing the intricate system of checks and balances that would become the U.S. Constitution, Jefferson was dreaming of a world with almost no government at all. His ideal society was like that of the Native Americans, who lived, he believed, in a state of natural harmony without formal laws or rulers. He was, at his core, a radical, a utopian. He found the new Constitution, with its powerful central government, deeply troubling. "I am not a friend to a very energetic government," he confessed to Madison. "It is always oppressive." His distance in Paris, however, proved to be a blessing. It allowed him time to adjust, to be persuaded by Madison's careful arguments. In the end, he gave his reluctant support, but with one major condition: the addition of a Bill of Rights, a document that would explicitly limit the power of the new government and protect the sacred realm of individual liberty. For Jefferson, government was not the solution, it was the problem. The best government was the one that governed least, the one that was closest to being no government at all. This was the man who, after serving as Washington's Secretary of State, would finally get his wish. He would retire to Monticello. In 1794, Jefferson returned to his mountain. "I have my house to build, my fields to farm," he wrote, "and to watch for the happiness of those who labor for mine." The image he cultivated was that of Cincinnatus, the Roman general who saved the Republic and then returned to his plow. It was the classic ideal of the virtuous farmer, leaving the corrupt world of politics behind for the simple purity of the land. But, as with so many things in Jefferson's life, the reality was far more complicated. First, he wasn't really a farmer. He was a planter, a man who owned a vast estate and nearly 200 enslaved people. And he was massively in debt. His elegant lifestyle, his endless book buying, his passion for fine wines, it had all caught up with him. He owed a fortune to British creditors, and the interest was compounding faster than he could pay it. Farming, for Jefferson, was not a philosophical pursuit. It was a desperate attempt to make money. He abandoned tobacco, which he called a culture of infinite wretchedness because it destroyed the soil, and switched to wheat. He devised an elaborate 7-step crop rotation plan, a marvel of scientific agriculture. But his plans were constantly thwarted by the harsh realities of farming: droughts, frosts, pests, and bad luck. His real passion wasn't for the fields, but for projects. He was a tinkerer, an inventor, a builder. The most successful enterprise on his mountain during these years was not a farm, but a small factory, a nailery. Every morning, he would walk down to the nailery to weigh out the iron rods for a dozen young enslaved boys, aged 10 to 16. Every evening, he would return to weigh the nails they had produced, rewarding the most efficient workers with a new suit of clothes. Here, on his idyllic mountain, in the heart of his agrarian utopia, was a small, sweat-soaked factory, a preview of the industrial world he claimed to despise. Ellis points out the incredible irony. Jefferson, the great apostle of the rural life, was running a small-scale assembly line. He seemed utterly oblivious to the contradiction. His greatest project, of course, was Monticello itself. Soon after his return from France, he began a massive renovation. He essentially tore down his original house and started again, determined to build an American masterpiece in the neoclassical Palladian style he had fallen in love with in Europe. It was a financially insane decision for a man on the brink of bankruptcy. But when it came to his personal environment, cost was no object. For most of his retirement, Monticello was a chaotic construction site, a noisy, dusty, half-finished dream. This was where Jefferson was truly happy, not behind a plow, but behind a drafting table, designing, building, creating his own perfect world. And all of this, the farming, the nail-making, the building, was done by enslaved people. His return to Monticello forced him into a daily, intimate relationship with the institution he claimed to hate. By the 1790s, his public position on slavery had shifted. The fiery young revolutionary who had denounced slavery in the Declaration of Independence was gone. In his place was a cautious, world-weary man who now argued for procrastination. He was caught in a trap of his own making. He believed that blacks and whites could not live together in a free society. The deep-rooted prejudices of whites and the 10,000 recollections of injustice by blacks would, he feared, lead to a race war. Emancipation, therefore, had to be coupled with expatriation, sending all freed slaves to Africa or the Caribbean. But the logistics and the cost of such a plan were staggering, and he knew it. "We have the wolf by the ears," he wrote in one of his most famous lines, "and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." So he did nothing. He created a paternalistic fantasy in which he was not a master, but a benevolent father caring for his family, black and white. He designed his plantation in a way that made the harshest realities of slavery almost invisible to him. The field hands worked on farms far from the mountaintop. The slaves he interacted with daily were house servants and skilled artisans, mostly from one family, the Hemings family. The Hemingses enjoyed a privileged status at Monticello. It was an open secret that this was because they were of mixed race, and that several of them, including Sally Hemings, were the children of Jefferson's own father-in-law, John Wales. They were, quite literally, his late wife's half-siblings. The presence of the light-skinned Hemings family all around him was a constant, visible reminder that his great fear, the mixing of the races, was not some future threat. It was happening in his own house, on his own mountain. It was another contradiction he chose to live with, another difficult reality he walled off in a sealed chamber of his mind. He was a master of what Ellis calls a diplomacy of the interior regions. He had an incredible capacity for self-deception, an ability to hold his highest ideals and his darkest realities in separate compartments, never allowing them to collide. This serene, self-contained world could not last. The political storms he had fled were gathering again, and they would soon pull the reluctant farmer from his mountain and place him at the very center of American power. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third President of the United States. He called it the Revolution of 1800, a peaceful revolution that restored the true principles of 1776 after a decade of Federalist corruption. The legend says he rode to his inauguration alone on horseback, hitched his horse to a post, and walked in like an ordinary citizen. The reality was a little different. He walked, but he was accompanied by a small parade of militia officers and congressmen. The statement he was making was not about democracy as we know it, but about Republican simplicity. He was rejecting the formal, almost monarchical style of Washington and Adams. He was purging the government of its aristocratic pretensions. His first inaugural address is a masterpiece of political rhetoric. It's filled with soaring phrases about American destiny, but its most famous line was meant to heal the bitter partisan wounds of the 1790s, We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. It sounded like a generous, conciliatory gesture. But Ellis reveals the subtle truth. In Jefferson's handwritten draft, Republicans and Federalists were not capitalized. He wasn't talking about the two political parties. He was saying that all Americans believed in a Republican form of government and a federal union. It was a clever, almost invisible, piece of rhetorical maneuvering. His goal as president was to implement his vision of a minimalist government. A wise and frugal government, he said, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement. This meant one thing above all else: eliminating the national debt. For Jefferson, debt was the ultimate source of political corruption. It was the engine that powered the big, powerful, intrusive government he despised. He instructed his brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, to make debt retirement the administration's highest priority. This required deep cuts in government spending. He slashed the Army and Navy, closed embassies abroad, and eliminated all internal taxes. What farmer, what mechanic, what laborer, he asked proudly, ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States? He was creating a government that was, as he wished, almost invisible. He even conducted the presidency in a way that made himself invisible. He stopped giving speeches to Congress, submitting his annual messages in writing instead. He made no public appearances. He worked for 10 hours a day at his desk, managing the government through a vast correspondence. It was, as Ellis calls it, a textual presidency, perfectly suited to his reclusive, writerly temperament. But this quiet, minimalist presidency was about to be rocked by an event that would force Jefferson to confront the greatest contradiction of his political life. The vast territory west of the Mississippi River, known as Louisiana, belonged to Spain. Jefferson was content with this arrangement. Spain was a weak, declining power, a placeholder until the United States was ready to expand. But in 1802, rumors flew that Spain had secretly ceded Louisiana to France, now under the rule of the ambitious and unpredictable Napoleon Bonaparte. Jefferson was horrified. "There is on the globe one single spot," he wrote to his ambassador in Paris, "the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans." French control of New Orleans meant control of the Mississippi River, the vital artery for American commerce. From that moment, he wrote, in a stunning declaration for such a famous Francophile, "We must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation." He dispatched James Monroe to Paris with instructions to buy New Orleans and as much of the Gulf Coast as possible. But Napoleon, in a characteristic display of impulsive genius, made a counteroffer. He had just lost an army in Haiti to a slave revolt and yellow fever. His dreams of a new world empire were shattered. He needed money for his wars in Europe. He offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory. All of it. For $15 million, about 3 cents an acre, the United States doubled in size overnight. It was a breathtaking coup, the greatest achievement of Jefferson's presidency. But it presented him with a massive constitutional crisis. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government had only those powers explicitly granted to it in the Constitution. And the Constitution said nothing about acquiring foreign territory. By his own principles, the Louisiana Purchase was illegal. He drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize it, but his advisors warned him that the process would take too long. Napoleon might change his mind. Jefferson was trapped between his most cherished principle and the opportunity of a lifetime. He chose the opportunity. "It is incumbent on those who accept great charges," he later wrote, "to risk themselves on great occasions." He urged Congress to ratify the treaty in silence, to act now and worry about the constitutional niceties later. The man who had built his career on limiting the power of the federal government had just performed the most expansive act of executive power in American history. He had become, for a moment, the very kind of powerful, decisive leader he had always warned against. The irony was not lost on his Federalist opponents. But the sheer scale of the achievement overwhelmed all criticism. He had secured an empire for liberty, a vast, open space where his agrarian dream could flourish for generations to come. The West was Jefferson's magic elixir. It was the place where all of America's problems could be solved, where the corruptions of the old world could be left behind. It was the one thing for which he was willing to bend, and even break, his own rules. But even this great triumph was shadowed by scandal. In 1802, a disgruntled journalist named James Callender, a man Jefferson had once paid to attack his political enemies, published the story that had been whispered in Virginia for years. "It is well known," Callender wrote, "that the man, whom it delighteth the people to honor, keeps, and for many years past has kept, as his concubine, one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally." The story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings exploded in the Federalist press. They called her the African Venus, his mahogany-colored charmer. The accusations were relentless, and they stained Jefferson's reputation for the rest of his life, and for all of history. Jefferson never responded publicly. He maintained a wall of perfect silence. And for nearly 200 years, the story remained a mystery. A battle between the oral tradition of the Hemings family, who insisted they were Jefferson's descendants, and the denials of his white descendants and most mainstream historians. Then, in 1998, science intervened. A DNA study proved, beyond a reasonable doubt, a genetic link between the Jefferson male line and a descendant of Sally Hemings' youngest son, Eston. The longest-running soap opera in American history had reached its final episode. The story was true. The man who wrote the sacred words of American liberty had been living a secret life, fathering children with an enslaved woman who was also his late wife's half-sister. This is the deepest, most troubling part of the Jeffersonian paradox. It's a contradiction that cannot be explained away. It can only be confronted. It forces us to see him not as a marble saint, but as a man of profound genius and profound flaws, a man who embodied the highest aspirations and the deepest hypocrisies of his time, and of our own. After a second term as president that was plagued by foreign policy troubles and the disastrous Embargo Act, Jefferson finally retired to Monticello for good in 1809. "Never did a prisoner, released from his chains," he wrote, "feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power." He was home. For the last 17 years of his life, he was the sage of Monticello, a living legend, one of the last survivors of the heroic age. The final chapter of his life was dominated by two great projects, and one great friendship. The first project was a flood of correspondence. He received over 1,000 letters a year, and felt obligated to answer everyone. "Is this life?" he asked, describing himself as a mill horse, who sees no end to his circle but in death. But one correspondent was different. In 1812, after years of bitter political estrangement, John Adams wrote him a short, cordial note. It was the beginning of one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history. For the next 14 years, the two old revolutionaries, the North and South poles of the American Revolution, explained themselves to each other, and to us. They wrote about everything: aging, religion, books, grief, the nature of aristocracy. Their letters are a magnificent dialogue between the two sides of the American mind: Jefferson's soaring optimism versus Adams's skeptical realism, Jefferson's faith in the goodness of man versus Adams' belief in the stubborn power of human passion and ambition. They argued, they reminisced, they postured for posterity. They were creating their final monument, not in stone, but in words. The second great project was the University of Virginia. It was Jefferson's final obsession, his academical village. He designed everything, from the curriculum to the buildings. It was the architectural embodiment of his ideals. There would be no chapel, a radical departure for its time. He banned the teaching of theology. The university would be a temple of reason. The campus itself was a physical expression of his philosophy. Instead of one large, imposing building, he designed a series of pavilions for professors, flanked by student rooms, all arranged around a central lawn. It was a community, not a fortress. It was designed to foster intimacy, to break down the walls between teacher and student, to create a family of scholars. It was, in its own way, another one of his utopian dreams, a perfect world of self-government and intellectual freedom. But as he poured his final energies into these projects, a shadow was falling over his optimistic vision of America's future. In 1820, the nation was convulsed by the Missouri crisis. The question of whether slavery should be allowed to expand into the new Western territories threatened to tear the Union apart. Jefferson was terrified. He called it a fire bell in the night. He saw it as a Federalist plot to destroy the Republic by dividing it along a geographical line. But his proposed solution was a strange and desperate one. He argued for diffusion, the idea that allowing slavery to spread into the West would somehow dilute its evil and lead to its eventual demise. It was a piece of magical thinking, a final, futile attempt to escape the terrible logic of the problem he had spent his life avoiding. John Adams was horrified. Slavery was a cancer, he said. To claim that spreading it would cure it was madness. In his final years, Jefferson's optimism about America's future began to waver. He saw the rise of a powerful federal government, the bitter sectional conflicts over slavery, and he feared that the useless sacrifice of his generation was about to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons. "I regret," he wrote, "that I am now to die in the belief that my only consolation is to be, that I live not to weep over it." But this was not his final word. His public legacy had to be one of hope. In the final weeks of his life, he was invited to Washington for the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He was too frail to travel, but he sent a written statement. It was his last testament to the world. May it be to the world the signal of arousing men to burst the chains and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. All eyes are opened, or opening, to the rights of men. He died a few days later, on July 4, 1826. 50 years to the day after his most famous words were given to the world. In an almost unbelievable stroke of providence, John Adams died a few hours later, hundreds of miles away in Massachusetts. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." In the literal sense, he was wrong. But in the long, complicated story of America, he was right. The contradictions, the ideals, the dreams, the hypocrisies, they all survived. The Sphinx remained, its riddle unanswered, at the very heart of the nation Jefferson had helped to create. Commentary. So, what do we do with a man like Thomas Jefferson? What is the enduring legacy of this American Sphinx? Joseph Ellis's book doesn't give us an easy answer. And that, I think, is its greatest strength. It resists the temptation to turn Jefferson into either a saint or a sinner. It shows him to us as he was, a brilliant, visionary, and deeply flawed human being who embodied the very best and the very worst of the American experiment. His life reminds us that history is not a simple story of good versus evil. It's a messy, complicated, and often tragic story of imperfect people striving for noble ideals, and often failing to live up to them. One of the most powerful lessons from this book is about the nature of ideals themselves. Jefferson's greatest gift to us was his soaring idealism, his belief in human freedom, in the power of reason, in the possibility of a better world. That idealism is the engine of all progress. It's the star we steer by. But his life is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of idealism when it's not grounded in reality. His tendency to create perfect worlds in his mind often made him blind to the imperfections in himself and in the world around him. His hatred of conflict and his need for harmony led him to practice a kind of self-deception that allowed him to live with the profound contradiction of slavery. He teaches us that it's not enough to have noble dreams. We also have to have the courage to confront the difficult, messy, and often painful realities that stand in the way of those dreams. We have to be willing to do the hard work of turning our ideals into action, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it forces us to confront our own hypocrisies. So, how can we apply this to our own lives? First, we can learn to embrace complexity. In a world that often demands simple answers and clear-cut heroes, Jefferson's life teaches us to be comfortable with ambiguity and contradiction. The people we admire, the nations we love, and even we ourselves, are a mix of light and shadow. Acknowledging that isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom. Second, we can practice what I'll call honest idealism. Let's hold on to our highest aspirations, our Jeffersonian dreams of a better world. But let's also cultivate an Adams-like honesty about the challenges and imperfections that we face. Let's not be afraid to confront the brute concrete facts of the world as it is, as the historian Carl Becker once said of Jefferson. True progress happens when our ideals and our realities are in constant, honest conversation with each other. Finally, Jefferson's story is a profound reminder that we are all, in our own way, a work in progress. He never stopped learning, never stopped building, never stopped striving to create a more perfect world, even as he failed to perfect himself. His legacy is not a set of easy answers. It's a set of enduring questions. And by wrestling with those questions, by confronting the riddle of the American Sphinx, we continue the work of the revolution he helped to begin. We continue the messy, difficult, and beautiful work of building a more perfect union. We've journeyed through the major moments of Jefferson's life today, guided by the brilliant work of Joseph J. Ellis in American Sphinx. But this is just the map. The book itself is the territory. The real magic happens when you read it for yourself, when a particular story or a simple phrase hits you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time. If any part of this story has sparked your curiosity about the man who dreamed of liberty while living a paradox, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's about understanding the complex soul of America. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if this exploration was valuable to you, a simple click on the like button and a subscribe helps us continue to bring these incredible stories from the world's best books to you. Your support allows us to keep digging into the ideas that have shaped our world. Let's keep growing together.